Thank you for joining us for what I'm sure is still a very timely and very important conversation about the U.S.-Saudi relationship in the wake of the tragic assassination of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. We have a great, accomplished, but also very diverse panel, as you can see. I am biased not only for having Ali on the panel, but also Dennis, my first boss in this town. But I'm sure it will be a great conversation. Before I hand it over to Elise, who needs no introduction, I just want to remind you all to please indulge us by turning off your phones or at least silencing them. And with that, I'll hand it over to Elise. Thank you.
Thank you for us. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Colleagues. Are the mics on? I think they are.
Yeah. Mic is on, yeah.
So as I was saying, it's great to see so many friends, colleagues, and people that I've not only spoken to in my work, but have come to rely upon for your insights and analysis on Saudi Arabia and the region. So thank you for joining us today. We were here about a year ago when Crown Prince Mohammed was coming to the U.S. for a big visit, and we talked about the promise and the opportunities that could be afforded by this new leadership in Saudi Arabia. And I think a year makes a big difference in terms of some of the questions we're asking ourselves. And I don't think there's a better panel to discuss it. You have their bios in front of you. Aaron Miller, Karen Elliott House, Dennis Ross, and Ali Shihabi. To read their bios really would not do them justice. You can take a look at them yourselves. These are some of the foremost people talking about and thinking about Saudi Arabia and the region right now. So I think what we'll do is we're just going to dive into it. It's not going to be really a politically correct conversation, so I hope we don't disappoint you. I'm glad you tore yourselves away from the Michael Cohen testimony, and hopefully we'll give you something equally as provocative and as interesting today. We find ourselves at a real inflection point, Aaron, I think, in terms of the U.S. looking at its role in the world, particularly in the region, and its conversation with and its relationship with Saudi Arabia. There was so much promise when we sat here a year ago about the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and in the wake of Jamal's death and some of the other issues that we've seen with Saudi Arabia, we find ourselves in a much different period.
We do. First of all, it's an honor to be here with everybody: Ali, Dennis, Karen, and of course the inestimable Elise Labott. Full disclosure, Ali was a friend of mine. He was due to come to the Wilson Center.
Jamal.
Jamal was a friend of mine. He was due to come to the
I
Wilson
hope I'm still a friend of yours, by the way.
You are. He was due to come to the Wilson Center as a visiting Arab journalist in a program generously provided by David Ottaway, who I think is here. I'll make my views very clear. I think it was H.L. Mencken who wrote, not far from here in Baltimore, that in a democracy it's unfashionable, very unfashionable, to talk about the disease without coming up with a remedy. And the fact is, 20 plus years in government have convinced me that we are too much in a rush to do without thinking about the nature and the dimension, not so much of the disease, but of the problem. And I think that's where the conversation needs to start. What is the issue? What is the problem? Do we have a Saudi problem? Do we have an MBS problem? Or in effect, is it the same thing? And I would only make three brief points. The US-Saudi relationship is under enormous stress. Some would argue it was buried in the ashes of 9/11. I think that may or may not be correct in terms of confidence and trust and public perception. But there are three issues that have created a perfect storm. The dynamic that drove this relationship for decades. First book I ever wrote was called Search for Security, the history of the study of Saudi Arabian oil and American foreign policy. The dynamic that drove this relationship, oil for security, is under great stress, whether it's broken down or not, or dysfunctional, unclear. We don't need their oil, although we have freed ourselves from Arab hydrocarbons, the rest of the world has not. but it's given us a new flexibility and independence. And they don't trust us when it comes to our security. A lot of this was driven by Bush 43 during the Iraq War. For the first time, 800 years, a Shia government reigns in Baghdad. I'm not sure the Saudis have ever recovered from Bush 43's freedom agenda or Barack Obama's being on the right side of history. That's the first component. The relationship was under severe stress. Second is MBS himself. Could rule Saudi Arabia for 50 years. Let's hope that the next 40 plus, once he becomes king, are more prudent and wise than the last year and a half. He's proven himself to be impulsive and reckless, not just undermining American interests. That he's done for sure in any number of cases, but he's also undermined American values, which we have a stake in promoting. And finally, the Trump administration. Dennis and I have been around the US-Saudi relationship and US foreign policy for a long time. And R's and D's have both acquiesced, placated, appeased Saudi governments in the past, perhaps with good reason. Here, we have taken acquiescent appeasement and placating the Saudis to a level of intensity that has surrendered the initiative, the flexibility, the leverage that the most consequential power on earth needs to have. You put these three things together, dysfunction in the US-Saudi relationship, MBS's recklessness, under the guise of reform to be sure, and the Trump administration's policy or lack of policy. And I think we confront a very serious problem that deserves a fair amount of thought with respect to what to do about it.
And I think you bring up a really interesting point that, I think Jamal is in the minds and hearts of all of us today. But this panel is not really going to be about Jamal and what happened to him, although we're going to look at some of the, investigation and consequences of that. But I think I've said, and I think others have said, that his legacy will really be that we confront some of the tough questions that he was, warning about and writing about before he was killed. And Aaron, you set us off for a good conversation. Now, Karen, it's interesting. We know that the relationship hasn't changed really, since Jamal's murder. Did the U.S. give up its leverage here? And you've said very eloquently that the U.S. needs to kind of take some of its eggs out of the MBS or Saudi basket and start, be less dependent and thinking of the relationship in a new way. Did we give up all our leverage here? Is there a way to turn this around?
Can I just go back before that?
Sure.
I mean, it seems to me the major thing going on in the Middle East and in the world is everyone trying to adjust to a post-US major role in the Middle East. I mean, people see that we're exiting as inevitably as they saw the British at another time. And the irony is that we have this independence from Saudi Arabia. I totally agree on our oil situation is completely different, but we have a president who has narrowed the U.S. ability to maneuver. But when I was in Saudi Arabia in January, people are already beginning to worry about what happens if Trump doesn't win in 2020. The need to hedge bets, and the trip to China. It's not the first time. King Abdullah's first trip was to China in 2005, so there's been a long, slow move, but I think it takes on new urgency in their minds as they wonder. They don't trust the U.S. They truly don't. So the Prince Turki Faisal is fond of saying the relationship has gone up and down over 70 years like a heart chart, and that's true. He seems to want to put a positive spin on that yes, the chart's down now, but it will go up again. But I think there are some underlying issues, trust issues on both sides, leave aside Donald Trump. that the Saudi government is not very sure it can trust the U.S., and certainly the U.S. Congress and the U.S. people are not so sure about the kind of relationship they want with Saudi Arabia. So things are clearly in flux, and I don't know if Jared and Donald can bring anybody closer together, or if this, plan that comes out in a few weeks will be just
Right.
another talking point that brings nothing.
It's interesting how you say, Jared and Donald, as if the relationship is really between, the president and his son-in-law and the crown prince, as opposed to, this decades, almost century-long relationship with Saudi Arabia and the consequences of that. Dennis, this is not, the Jamal murder was not, just one troubled event. I mean, there's been this questions over the last couple of years about, intimidation of political opponents. You had the Ritz-Carlton debacle where, dozens of members of the royal family and businessmen were, virtually held there, and in some cases, questions of torture. You had the virtual, if you don't want to call it a kidnapping, call it what you will, of the Lebanese prime minister. I mean, is this what the international community is signing up for the next 50 years? I think we're assuming at this point, and we can talk about it later, about whether there's any chance that the crown prince doesn't accede to the throne. But, I mean, is this what we should expect?
Well, I hope not. Look, I think both Aaron and Karen have identified contextual features that are shaping the relationship and questions right now. I do think one of the key things to bear in mind is, if we're going to have Mohammed bin Salman in power for, say, the next 40 or 50 years, what do we do to help ensure that these kinds of behaviors, reckless, impulsive, that ultimately don't serve Saudi interests, what do we do to try to affect that? I mean, you're weighing what is a couple of different realities and a larger strategic stake at the same time. It's true we don't depend upon Saudi oil, but the oil market is fungible. You have a major disruption in oil coming out of the Middle East, that affects us. It affects the global economy. So yeah, we don't depend upon Saudi oil, but suddenly if there's 20% less oil available in the world market, you probably have a global deep recession or depression. So that interest hasn't fundamentally changed, even if shale and renewables and so forth create a different set of options. Stability in Saudi Arabia and in the region could be heavily affected by the successful transformation of Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's not just the issue of women driving, it's the issue of a national transformation plan whose purpose is to transform the country socially and economically, and to make nationalism replace Wahhabism as a source of legitimacy. Well, since Wahhabism is basically the ideology that we've had to fight internationally in terms of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth, that's actually something that's profoundly in our interest. So how, on the one hand, do we take what is our interest and our stake in the transformation of Saudi Arabia, which was never going to be carried out from below, it was always going to require a revolution from above, how do we square that with what are a set of behaviors that reflect a kind of authoritarianism that ultimately could be self-defeating to those interests, meaning not just ours, but also, I think, what Mohammed bin Salman himself seems to want to achieve. So for me, I think the question, getting back to what you've asked, is how does the United States use its leverage? I think we still have leverage. I don't think that.
But you don't have leverage if you don't want to use it.
Well,
Exactly.
First of all, you don't have leverage if you're not prepared to exercise it.
If you're not what?
Prepared to exercise it.
Yeah.
And two, in a sense, I would say what the president has done in terms of shielding Mohammed bin Salman from the Congress has actually created more of an incentive on the part of the Congress to have to do more. And the nature of the defense, well, we need it because of arms sales, which is not going to persuade anybody. we might need to manage this relationship because we actually have a huge strategic stake in seeing a successful model of development for the first time in the Middle East. We might have a huge strategic stake because actually having nationalism and modernization become the pillar of legitimacy could affect governance, not just there, but elsewhere. The idea that it's arms sales, it says, not only does it signal that values don't matter, but it also puts an accent on the wrong thing. So for me, I would like to see us use the leverage we have precisely because the Saudis still understand. Look, when they look around the world and they say, who's there to protect our security? Well, it's not the Russians, they're the problem. Maybe you have to accommodate them, but they're not the source of your security. It's not the Chinese because they do road and belt. They don't do security. It's not the Europeans, well, because they're from Venus, not Mars.
Okay, but in October, and everybody's words are going to come back to bite them at this panel, but in October you wrote, MBS has to understand that the ends don't justify the means. How is he supposed to understand that if the U.S. is not willing to?
Those words don't bite. He has to understand. No, but that's in a sense what I'm getting at. The U.S. has to be clear. It has to draw limits. Yes, there had to be a price for what was done to Khashoggi. It's morally wrong, and it was stupid. From every standpoint, it was wrong. But it's also wrong because it's a global norm. If a global norm like this is simply eroded, it's going to affect not just Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere. So one of the things we had to do is we had to make it clear there's a price for this. To get back to the original question you asked, there is a very strong American need to ensure that Mohammed bin Salman, if he's going to be there for 40 or 50 years, is chastened. And he learns a lesson from this, and it affects his behavior. What we have done to this point is not enough to be able to produce that.
Ali, so, I mean, you don't just talk to, people in the Crown Prince's arena, but you're talking to other people in the country, in the royal family. I mean, honestly, what does the royal family think of this behavior? Not just about Jamal and possible implications that he ordered it, but the idea of some of the other adventures that have come back to be very unpopular globally. I mean, this specifically with Jamal, this is not something that is in keeping with Saudi behavior.
Look, change is unpopular. That's why you find it so difficult among politicians around the world, particularly democratic politicians, to affect major change, right? So you have, and Saudi Arabia was run by extremely wise, extremely experienced, elderly leaders who virtually did nothing for the last 50 years. My professional career started at the central bank in 1985, and I saw the economy and simple structural things that needed to be changed took 10 years, and sometimes they were never even implemented. So a young man came in, a change agent, and the recklessness can be a double-edged sword. For example, had he sat around the table and brought wisdom, uber wisdom all around the table, and he would have said, I want to take on the Wahhabi establishment. I want to change the narrative domestically and internationally. I want to, and it's not just women driving, I want to integrate women into the workforce. They would have said, Your Highness, you have a 50-year career. It's not wise to do that. It's reckless to do that because you're going to alienate them. Take your time, on some of the issues, economic issues like subsidies. Saudi Arabia, per capita usage of water is higher than in Europe. And water costs a fortune in Saudi Arabia. So he hit utilities, and which was very unpopular because he pushed the price of utilities up. I mean, Greece, after going bankrupt, still didn't have the political will to do the utility. So he did a lot of things within the country, and effectively he disenfranchised a large portion of the royal family. I wrote a book 5 years ago, which was very controversial. It's actually banned in the Gulf. And one of the things I worried about, this was before Mohammed bin Salman came in, I worried about that you have a 20,000 person size royal family that is unmanageable. And I called for the succession to become a vertical one, a father to son one, because that's the only way that monarchies have been able to survive over the last few hundred years. I mean, the fact that you have 20,000 people with the title of prince getting dividends with expectations was dragging the whole system down. So here comes a man who takes all these things on at warp speed. Maybe not wise, but you know what? It has worked with the Wahhabi establishment. Our first event here a year and a half ago was Wahhabism and terrorism. And we invited Senator Murphy here. And we had an earful about exporting Wahhabism and, how the Saudi government, everybody was talking Wahhabism and terrorism, Here he comes in 2 years, he puts really the Wahhabi clergy back in a box. Not only has the domestic narrative changed, and an example came last week, which is very, very amusing because it caused a bit of amusement on social media. There's a cleric called Mohammed Al-Arifi who has 15 million followers on Twitter. And he's probably one of the most charismatic clerics. He had banned, and he and many of the conservative clerics had banned visiting ancient sites, pre-Islamic sites in Saudi Arabia. Because history starts with Islam as far as the clerics are concerned. And he had banned it. He went out to the new Mada'in Saleh Al-Ula and did a promotional video, right? Now many people made fun of him, but hey, the guy changed his story 180 degrees. So there's a tremendous amount has been done. Now, in the meantime, a lot of mistakes have happened. It's a young leader. Acquired wisdom takes time. It's a young administration. Some of the advisors also around him were not experienced. And he was doing too much too quickly, maybe. So yes, some things, were immature. Canada, Germany. The Hariri thing was not managed well. And also, obviously, Jamal's was horrific. But I think these things Riyadh has certainly understood that message.
What evidence is you haven't heard the Crown Prince come out himself. You've heard people around him, but you have not heard the Crown Prince himself come out and say the buck stops with me, even if he's not willing to speak of his own alleged involvement in it. He has not kind of taken responsibility for the actions of his government. To date, nobody has been punished as far as I can see. What evidence of contrition, of maturing of leadership, can he show his supporters? Is there any reason to point to something that says that he hasn't learned and is willing to understand that this behavior has consequences for his leadership?
Look, it's a pity he hasn't come up publicly to say the buck stops with me, but I heard him telling Martin Smith of Frontline in Riyadh in January, December, that the buck stops with me. And I was telling some people, I said, I wish we could put that in a video clip and put it on social media. He realizes that.
Why didn't?
Why not?
Yes.
Why
I don't know. Look, I've always had a problem with the way Saudi Arabia communicates. I think that fundamentally, the DNA of the system does not understand communication. If you're an American politician, from the day you run for dog catcher, you've got to learn how to communicate, right? The Saudi system, the difference between now and 5 years ago is they say they know it, but they still don't understand communication. So, and I think a lot of the problems have been in communication, you see? But another thing that they have done, for example, one of the problems was, and particularly that caused the Khashoggi problem, is that some powerful people would come straight up to the Crown Prince, catch him in the corridor, for example, and say, Jamal's coming to Istanbul, we're going to deal with him. And Crown Prince nods and walks away. Nobody knows what that means, you see? And then what has happened now?
The evidence that's come out that suggests otherwise.
No, there's no evidence. There's no smoking gun. But let me just
because there's no smoking gun, let's put aside the issue of
there has to be evidence, Elise. People, when it suits them, everybody wants him to be implicated, you see? Show me the evidence.
I don't know. Yes, but I'm just going to make one point.
But I want to just answer your question, which I didn't finish. You said, what signs that he's been chastened?
Okay.
For example, the whole infrastructure, aside from these people being fired, the infrastructure on the royal court has been reorganized to create an institutional process. So people cannot go to him and get one-on-one approval for issues. There's a National Security Council set up, and he's very keen to make sure that that works. So certainly this has been a shock. Certainly it's been embarrassing. Certainly they've paid a price, and he's paid a price.
What's the price?
Well, the price is all the I mean, as a young leader, he's very concerned. When he came to America and was received like a superstar. Of course, every leader likes that, for God's sake. Gorbachev died to get the adulation of the West. Every leader likes the adulation of the West. That has been gone, you see. So there is a price that's been paid. But a lot of good has been done. And my point with Americans who criticize is absolutely criticize. But at the same time, recognize the good that's been done, because that's going to encourage him in the right direction.
I'm reminded of, I think it was Paul Begala in reference to one.
Can you identify who these people are?
I think it was Paul Begala, a Democratic strategist, who said about some candidate or administration that it's like the Titanic. The problem isn't communications. The Titanic had an iceberg problem, not a communications problem. And the reality is, why show contrition? Why change an MO which argues that with money and power and influence, we can buy our way out of this? And at a certain point, the world will acquiesce. And I suspect that's something that the Trump administration fundamentally believes. So I think Elise's question on contrition, change, some sign of wisdom and prudence, and adult supervision, but there is no adult supervision. There's only the Crown Prince.
Can I dispute that?
Just in a minute.
We have an hour and a half.
And the
so
institutionalization of the system has been institutionalized and subordinate under his control.
Sure.
So one additional point. Saudi Arabia can organize itself, in my judgment, along the lines of any way it wants to, all right? We are completely inept and incapable and unable and unwilling to change the internal structures of any of these Middle Eastern countries. Iraq and Afghanistan and our involvement there, I think, showed this. That's not what bothers me. What bothers me is the fact that we, and maybe we deserve it because we're not prepared to stand up.
But you're wrong.
What bothers me is that we're like some modern day Gulliver, wandering around in a part of the world that we don't understand, tied up by tiny and larger powers whose interests on many core issues are not our own, and we're tied up by our own illusions. And what this administration has done is to accord, in my judgment, to Saudi Arabia a level of significance and power on the core issues it believes the Saudis can further, which I think, frankly, is magical thinking. The Saudis, Ali, are not an ally of the United States. An ally is a country with whom there is a high coincidence of interests, of values, and a domestic, sustainable level of support. At best, under MBS, Saudi Arabia has become a partner whose interests episodically coincide with ours, without much reciprocity.
Right.
Just a quick point to say,
Karen.
I think you give the Trump administration a bad rap. Because, I'll tell you why.
Wouldn't be the first one.
Because my understanding is offline and in private, there's been a lot of tough love. And Pompeo and even Kushner and the White House and senior people from the State Department have given the message loud and clear.
In private.
In private, yeah, but that's where it makes an impact. You see, if you posture, then you get a reaction, like you even do with countries like China. But when you go sit in the room and you tell them, this is what has happened, and they have had an impact. Certain people were removed as a result of that sort of power, sort of influence. So do not think that the Trump administration has just whitewashed this whole thing. They have actually played a very aggressive private role.
Can I just, I don't want to, I know you're going to go to Karen, but I just want to make one quick comment on this. First, I agree with you. When you do things publicly, you put the other side in the corner, they have no choice but
Right,
to
calling
have a
for
kind
his
of-
head like members of Congress, right?
Right, but when you do things only privately, we too have a domestic audience. The ability to get the Congress to adopt the posture that the administration wants towards the Saudis is made much more difficult because they don't see the administration doing in public what they need to be doing. Okay, it can't mirror what they're saying in private necessarily, but there needed to be some readiness on the part of the administration to go to the Congress and say, look, here's what we're going to agree on in terms of sending an unmistakable signal that this is unacceptable. We're going to agree that we're going to suspend the delivery of offensive weapons for, say, a year. Now, the Congress would have said, okay, well, now we've made a statement where they're showing there's a price for what they've done. By not doing that, they've left the Congress in a position where the impulse is, well, the administration isn't doing anything, so we have to become even more extreme in terms of how we respond. If you're trying to protect the relationship, one of the ways you protect the relationship is by doing enough in public to be able to have credibility to say, look, you can tell that we're doing something in private.
And then when the president has to veto that, it further looks like he's in the pocket of the crown prince. I think that we do have a clear interest in domestic change in Saudi Arabia. And as Ali said, everybody has promised to get off oil for the last 40 years and done literally nothing. And he did come in and say, rightly or wrongly, with a lot of emergency, in essence, the house is on fire. We've got to get off oil, and I know how to do it, my consultants and I, and just sit down, shut up, and follow me. I'll show you the safe way out. And you know, the things he's done on encouraging, creating more opportunity for women to work, that's absolutely working. Female roles are changing and opportunities are growing. And I think we have a huge interest in that. And the last time we appeared together, there was a discussion about whether moderation is a feint or you know, something he really believes in. My view is, if he doesn't believe in it, he's gonna hang himself with it, because you can't make the kind of changes that are being made, women driving, women having, fundamentally challenging the male I'm in charge here role, and then expect to just roll it all back. It's possible, I guess, that he could try to put the lid on all of that again, but I think it would be extremely difficult. So that is in our interest too.
Okay.
But it is also in his interest and ours that I think that he does see there is some price to be paid for the, in essence, the history and traditional view in that part of the world is, if you're ruler, you can do what you want to.
Well, I want to unpack a little bit about what he's doing in the country, but just quickly, I mean, do you believe he can mature into someone more responsible, which, as Dennis wrote, understands that the ends don't justify the means, or you know, because he's ruler and he can do whatever he wants? I'll go back to the question I asked Aaron, or Ali rather, is this what we can come to expect?
I don't think people's fundamental character changes dramatically. I mean, you can learn to curb certain minor behaviors, but I don't think your instincts and your outlook, again, I cite Napoleon. You know, he was a young man who got a lot of power at an early age and wanted to use it the same way MBS does to change France, to stand up against Britain, and he wants to change Saudi Arabia to be able to stand up to Iran. And you know, Napoleon continued to do things, some very good, but the inability to learn to check your instinct that I'm right and I'm just going to go a little further. I would urge, if I were giving MBS advice, I would urge him to read a good biography of Napoleon.
Mm-hmm. Ali, I mean, it kind of opens the question. I mean, obviously, some of the things that we've all been talking about, opening reforms for women, transforming the economy, weaning off, you know, energy dominance on, you know, energy alone, and diversifying.
Wahhabism,
all admirable, needed, transformative, but if you're just imposing them by fiat, you know, who are these reforms for? You know, yes, he, lift this edict about women driving, but, women activists who didn't give him credit are, in jail. Other political opponents are being locked up or punished. And, what does this mean for the 2020 vision and for MBS in the kingdom? What role do reformers who are not part of his entourage have in this transformation of the country?
Well, look, change and reform is very, very difficult. And historians from de Tocqueville to Ian Bremmer today have pointed out how risky it is to effect change. So, has he become more authoritarian than the Saudi government usually has been? Yes, he has. Has that held the fort together? We've had the women's issue come out. We've had entertainment. I tweeted a crazy video the other day that Firas's father had taken in Jeddah of a woman dancing in a way with a dancing troupe in a supermarket or in a shopping center. And Saudi Twitterati were furious with me, but they said, this is not don't use this as an example of development. But it was an example, it was an example of change. Even if stupid, crazy things happen, if those things that happened 5 years ago, those girls would have been arrested immediately. So you have to hold the fort harder when you affect change. Now, that's an art, right? Clearly, it crossed the red line with the women, which was, in retrospect, a stupid decision and should be reversed as quickly as possible. Now, the government has come out and said the women have broken the law in certain areas. Well, again, this comes to communication.
Is there going to be a trial? Are these women really spies?
Exactly.
Are they working for Iran? Are they working for the Qataris?
My point is, if the government wanted to continue arresting, they should have come out and said, here's what we charged them with. They did neither. They kept them arrested and they kept quiet. So that's where I think you either release them immediately or you come out and say, here's a charge sheet. The Jamal thing obviously was way past the red line also. Has the system learned? Look, I want to give it the benefit of the doubt. I think it has, and I think he will mature with time and he will mature with experience. I think, I'm 60 now. I think when I was 30, I thought I knew everything about the world and everything. And life humbles you, right? So I think age and experience has a huge impact. And he has paid a price, you see. It hasn't been, Riyadh people are very concerned, you see. Don't think that people don't read what is said. Our best friends in the Senate and Congress have been so critical. And America is so important to Saudi Arabia. Really, what America says and what the White House says and what Congress says is listened to very carefully. So, again, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I think that he will mature and the system will mature and the right people around him will coalesce, which I see happening now. And I don't expect any more surprises. Now, if we meet in a year and there are another 2 or 3 surprises, you can throw that back at me.
I just wonder.
Saudis do expect more surprises.
Right.
I mean, they view, for better or for worse, that, sort of every 6 or 8 months something big happens. But he just released, if you noticed, in India and Pakistan, he promised to release their prisoners in Saudi Arabia. So it would create a good opportunity to
release the women,
follow and release.
I think the women will be released. And I think that the issue, once this issue became public, you had even the smart and wise people around the table start to say, well, if we release them tomorrow, we're going to look like we're buckling to Western public opinion or America. And then what about the people on the right that we have in jail? People will say just because the women are popular in America, you release them, but others you don't. So they're grappling with that. They're grappling with that.
Look, as someone who's also been in Saudi Arabia fairly recently, 2 months ago, it is impossible not to see how much the country has changed when you're there. You go into a restaurant and you see men and women together.
Not men sitting at one table and women sitting at
they're
another
together.
in proximity like a year ago,
Right.
but
It
sitting
is-
there
It is a
doing
different world.
something as nonchalantly
Right,
as...
because it's now normal, because it's a given. But it's not just that. You talk to You talk to women there. I had one say to me, we have a new ecosystem now. They think differently. There is an entirely different context, social context now. You know, how we manage the fact that he is changing Saudi Arabia, and the change socially is for the better. How we manage that on the one hand, and also try to help ensure that this process that you're describing is one that is a maturation process that happens sooner rather than later, where there's checks and balances. I will say this, people that I talked to there, on the one hand, they said if anything were to happen to him, the dark forces come back. The idea that he goes and everything will be, we'll just continue this way, dream on, that's an illusion. On the other hand, I also got the sense it would be really good if there was a system where there were more checks on him. So these kind of big surprises every 6 or 8 months, not positive surprises, in fact, somehow get diminished.
I just wonder if we're going back to that original question that Dennis wrote about, which is, do the ends justify the means? And yes, all these changes are important and necessary, but if the underlying, methods of imposing them is this, is that where, the U.S. should be concerned with the idea of that he's a reformer, but is he reformed?
Well, this problem of ends and means and the issue of authoritarian leadership in the Arab world is not a new one. I mean, we've dealt for 50 years with two different kinds of authoritarians. There were the acquiescent authoritarians, of which the Saudis were one, Ben Ali of Tunisia, Abdel Salah of Yemen, Mubarak, and now Sisi. And then there were what I call the adversarial authoritarians, the ones in which we actually engaged in confrontation. Brief period of an Iraq Saddam U.S. harmony, which I think cost us dearly. Gaddafi, the Assads. So this is not a new problem. How the United States bargained in a deal that promised false stability with the acquiescent authoritarians, most of whom are gone now. But now you have something new. You could argue that, and I think for years at State, we prayed for a Saudi leader who was not weak and not dependent. We prayed for a Saudi leader who was reformist. We prayed for a Saudi leader that would act not as a kind of appendage or derivative of U.S. policy, but would make a real contribution in partnership with the U.S. So on the reformist side, I could concede it all. How much bad does a man or woman have to do in order to do good? I mean, this is an age-old political problem.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy.
I'll come back to my central concern as an American. You'll figure whatever Saudi Arabia is going to be, it's going to be. That's when someone says, well, that's good for Saudi Arabia too, that's not for me to decide. What I care about, and what I think have been fundamentally undermined over the course of the last 18 months, is American interests and American values. And I think we have done very little to demonstrate that we care about either. I cannot understand really the policy of this administration toward Saudi Arabia. It has elevated the Saudis to a level of prominence in its own strategy on containing Iran. The Saudis are actually expanding Iranian opportunities in the region. They've hailed MBS as a reformer, and yet you yourself have admitted he's probably the most authoritarian leader, king, or would-be king, ever to emerge in the kingdom. I don't understand what is driving the Trump administration policy. Why the acquiescence? Why the appeasement? Why the inability to expose what is clearly a Saudi cover-up with respect to killing Jamal Khashoggi? And to do it in
Israel and re-election.
all right,
okay, so here's the question.
But even that,
Okay.
even that, I think, may prove to be a sort of false or overpromised bargain.
Well, is it, I mean, it does seem that there is this kind of effort to want to ride out this hurdle, thinking that it's bad for the relationship long term, but we're here for 4 to 8 years. We need to get shit done, and let's encourage him to do better and move on. So given that that's, pretty clearly, I think, if you would talk to U.S. officials candidly, maybe we can talk to one that's here in the room. Given that kind of posture, what can the U.S. do?
Trump cares about arms sales. I mean, creating jobs. I mean, that's
Right.
one of his
But
big things.
even that's been magical thinking.
Well, he cares about his own relationship.
And he is interested in getting the Saudis to support whatever his Palestinian plan is. I think that's probably a dream. And then obviously, and he thinks those two help get him reelected.
Dennis.
Look, the Saudis are not going to act alone in response to the Trump plan. And if the Trump
they're
plan,
not going to have to?
they will not act alone in response to the Trump plan. If the Trump plan doesn't gain the acceptance of the Jordanians, Egyptians,
Palestinians.
the Saudis might, if there was a collective of Arab leaders who felt that the plan crossed a threshold of seriousness, but would have to actually do that. They'd have to be able to point to what was real in it as it relates to statehood and as it relates to a capital for that state in a significant part of Arab East Jerusalem. They might say, we have questions about this, but we think it's serious. They might do that, regardless of where the Palestinians were, but they won't do it alone. They will not do it alone. If the Jordanians and Egyptians aren't prepared to say that as well, the Saudis will not be out there on alone. That's what you said. It is a fantasy to think that will be the case, that they will go alone.
Okay.
So in answer to your question, I think what Karen said is right, that the administration has, and the president views in Saudi Arabia this place where we'll sell arms, that'll create jobs, they will invest. When he came here, he talked about $400 billion in investments here.
Right.
All this was part of how the president sees I'm doing well by the economy.
I'm making America great again.
Well, I think that's how we saw Saudi Arabia fitting in. I tried to suggest a little earlier, and this is a little bit different from Aaron. Aaron's saying that whatever Saudi is going to be, it's going to be. And you're right, that because MBS, he doesn't say he's carrying out national transformation because of us. He's saying he's carrying it out because they need it. But the fact is, if he produces, it happens to be in our interest. Mm-hmm. It changes it discredits an extremist ideology, or Wahhabi ideology on the one hand. It creates a potential successful model of development for larger Arab states that has never existed and created a vacuum filled by whether they're secular radicals or they're Islamist radicals. That happens to be in our interests. So the challenge is, what is it that we can do with him to ensure that he doesn't engage in those kinds of behaviors that is threatening to our interests, and I would argue is actually threatening to his. That happens to fit our interests. Now, the challenge, therefore, Ali, is for what kind of an American policy, on the one hand, creates a set of limits that get respected, and yet at the same time, elevates or demonstrates that we support what is practically happening in Saudi Arabia that ultimately serves the region interest, not just our own.
But we're late to the party, Dennis. I mean, it's now.
Just because you're late to the party doesn't mean you can't bring a
Well,
gift.
but the headline looked real bad since October 2nd, and the trend line looks real bad. Right. Because I don't see
theirs or ours. What do you mean? Our
approach, our policy, our willingness to tether ourselves, regardless of what the Saudis do.
Just a quick thing.
To a conception.
How much is the anti-Trump political environment contributing to this?
That's a great question.
Anti-Saudi, anti-MBS.
I think a
issue?
fair amount, Ali, but I do not believe Congress is acting in a way, I think, that frankly goes beyond the political interest only. At least that's my bias, perhaps, my prejudgment. But I think it's right. I think they see a fundamental imbalance in our policy for reasons that they, and I think Dennis put it very well, that they really don't understand, because we have not articulated any set of constraints or any set of limits. We haven't imposed our own red lines. In the wake of Tiananmen, Dennis remembers this, Bush 41 suspended high-level contacts. And there are many differences between what happened in China in
Dennis
'89.
suggested that.
Right. And high-level contacts were suspended, and so were arms sales. We have done absolutely nothing. If you wanted a signal that contrition is not in order, if you wanted a message that in effect you could literally get away with murder, we have sent that signal every conceivable way. Mr. Kushner, back a minute on the peace plan, Mr. Kushner either did meet, has
in Riyadh
gone,
today, by the way.
all right, and intends, I'm sure, given the priority now, which is gaining Arab support for the ultimate deal plan, is again violating one of these red lines and sending the unmistakable message that we have given you a get out of jail free card. And frankly, it's not just going to be good for 6 months, it'll probably be good for the remainder of this administration and hopefully the next 4 years as well. We need to find a policy that navigates somewhere between abandonment, all right, which is unacceptable, and embrace, which is exactly what we're doing, and we've made.
See, Aaron, I think you're wrong. I really do. I think that Riyadh has gotten a lot of negative vibes from America. Now, not just the administration, but in totality. They watch what gets said in Congress. They watch what some of their previously close friends have been saying. It has had an impact. So
How?
nobody.
But
No, it has had on their psychology,
Okay,
on their,
but
on their,
on their
you will
policy and their
now
actions,
look,
how?
you will have to judge them as it going forward.
but
So-
you're asking this audience to take it on faith that they've
Well-
gotten the message.
well,
What's
because-
the evidence of that?
What is the evidence of that? I told you about internal changes that have done, but ultimately you will only be able to tell as time goes by. You see, but I think that there's a tremendous concern in Riyadh with the reaction in the United States, and it's been taken very, very seriously. So to think that America has given Saudi Arabia or MBS a get out of jail free card, I don't see that.
Well,
I see
there's
them
a
very
difference.
concerned.
Okay, Karen, isn't there a difference though, and maybe Dennis, you can weigh in. There's a difference between the administration being supportive of the relationship, and let's be honest, we've said this before, it's more that this administration is thinking more about the relationship of his administration and the White House with MBS, as opposed to this 70-year relationship between the US and Saudi. But, you know,
Sorry, but you
MBS
are
can't-
ignoring two things. You ignore the military-to-military relationship, which is very, very close, for example. You ignore the security relationship with the security, including
that
the CIA.
goes into the 70-year relationship.
That's very, very close. So institutionally, it's not just the White House.
I understand,
the
but-
permanent institutions of America that have a stake in the Middle East
Are
have
untouched.
tremendous working relationship.
Yes, and they're untouched.
Well, that serves American interests.
Okay,
You
but
see?
what I'm saying is the chief architect of like the relationship, MBS, cannot come to Washington right now. The ambassador, who I think by all accounts people thought was, you know, doing a good job, young, you know, but learning and had a future in Saudi Arabia. I know that there was always a suspicion that he was destined for larger things, but he couldn't really do his job effectively in the U.S. So where does that leave us?
I go back. My view is that MBS started out being very interested on domestic reform in Saudi Arabia. That is in the interest of Saudi Arabia and in the undeniable interest of the U.S. And where it seems to have gotten off the rails was with his Qatar decision, and when he starts dealing in foreign policy, he's not nearly as successful. So it seems to me it is in our interest, and it's in Trump's interest too, I would argue, is to get the focus, everybody's focus, back on changing the country.
Just a little point, Karen,
internally.
when everybody says this about foreign policy, but if you look at the totality of his foreign policy, right? Every foreign leader wants to gain the favor of the White House, right? He did a good job with that. He reached out to Russia and Putin, despite the very a complex
You
relationship.
visited Saudi Arabia in 2007.
Yes, but still, but it was reaching an agreement with Russia to effectively move from OPEC to a Saudi-Russian relationship to control oil, despite the complexities that Saudi Arabia has with Russia in the Middle East. That's a huge foreign policy success also, you know? So it's not like Qatar, at the end of the day, look, it's marginal. Qatar's
Why
marginal.
can't
Okay,
he
but
drop it
all right, but here's,
Hariri is marginal, you see. Yemen is not
Okay,
marginal.
Qatar isn't marginal to us.
Just because these, are you saying, let me just clarify something. Are you saying that because that some of these issues like Qatar or Lebanon, they're marginal countries, or what he did with that are marginal issues?
The impact of the problem is marginal for Saudi Arabia.
Not for the
no,
U.S.
yes,
on
that's
Qatar.
exactly right. It's,
I would dispute that on Qatar because I think at the end of the day, and they said this from the very beginning, that the military relationship with Qatari officers were in Riyadh last week in part of the joint GCC, and Saudi Arabia gave a commitment to America. Nothing will affect their air base or the airspace around that. Nothing will affect Qatari participation in the GCC. What has happened is that they've closed the borders to Qatar.
But one of the U.S. goals in the region was to create more security cooperation, and I think it may be smart of MBS to blow that up because I think a lot of people would like the U.S. to stay more actively involved. So maybe it was a deliberate and very smart plan. But it seems to me that it truly does mess
Well,
up
we can
a
debate
US,
that, but something like the
interest.
Russian relationship and being able to manage the oil market, which is Saudi Arabia's lifeblood, is very critical for the global economy
It's the
also.
lifeblood of Russia. I
Well,
mean, I don't see
yeah.
why.
Okay,
it
No,
isn't.
because there was never that level of cooperation, and the Russians were always operating alone, taking advantage of situations alone. There was never coordination.
and by the way, you know what? They still will.
Well,
The
let's
Russian
see.
track record of living up to agreements is not a really good track record. If
I
I were
wanna
the
bring-
Saudis, I wouldn't put a whole lot of store in agreements with the Russians.
I wanna
It is-
bring-
it's
okay,
a foreign
let's
policy
move on
success.
from Russia.
Yeah.
I want to, what does Saudi Arabia right now, given what's going on with Qatar, what's going on with Yemen, what is he bringing to the table in terms of regional diplomacy?
You know,
and
my view is
stability?
the Saudis has always been that because they're weak and dependent, it's still important that the primary interest of the United States is what to avoid. My expectations for Saudi Arabia have been preternaturally low for decades. I mean, there was a moment when MBS first appeared in which I thought to myself, whoa, maybe what we have here is a modern day version, with all of his imperfections and transgressions, of Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk. But what we got is not Ataturk on the Gulf. I think we got something much closer to Putin on the Gulf. But I just keep thinking to myself, our primary interest in Saudi Arabia, I know this is heretical, particularly in Washington and here, but frankly, I think Saudi Arabia is just not that important. And I think our primary objective should be to avoid bad things happening. I don't question the need for stability. That's absolutely central. But what I do question is the fact that we've tethered ourselves and identified objectives, policy objectives, loaded them on like ornaments on a, probably a bad analogy, Christmas tree, and the Saudis will not be able, they will continue to perpetually disappoint. They have to. And that's why I get back to the notion that our real problem is that we have very bad allies and worse adversaries. And frankly, I don't, in that situation, only I confess to you, we've come late to the party. The Trump administration has put its imprint down. I know exactly where they want to go. They'd like this to disappear. They will not act in any way that is assertive to hold MBS personally responsible. You have the agency, medium to high confidence. What does it actually mean? I haven't seen this report. And who knows, are they involved under the terms of Global Magnitsky in holding within 120 days? making a judgment as to whether senior Saudi officials, including MBS, were responsible, had foreknowledge, directed, targeted Jamal Khashoggi, and then to draw the implication that Magnitsky forces you to draw sanctions? No, they've completely undermined that process. They could direct NSA and CIA, maybe they're doing it on their own, to look back over the last 2 years, looking for chatter and intercepts that would further support their case. I think they don't want this. They want this to go away. And frankly, it will go away, but not from a public relations point
But
of
it's
view.
been a two-sided coin. I mean, if you were Saudi Arabia as an American, not ally, whatever you want to call it, for the last 20 years, partner, look what America did in Iraq. America came and destroyed Iraq, broke down the resistance to Iran, brought Iran in. So if Saudi Arabia is going to look at
that, though.
Sorry?
I mean, they weren't against that, though.
They were absolutely against that. Saudi Arabia came publicly and said, do not do this.
Abdullah was very clear.
And in fact, that is the most momentous, destabilizing act. You know, it puts Qatar to shame and puts everything else to shame.
On this we agree.
Dennis,
Well-
Dennis, are we buying into the Saudi narrative that Iran is the biggest threat here?
Oh, I don't think
And
that.
are they containing Iran? Are they helping to contain Iran, really?
Well, A, I think the narrative wasn't created by the Saudis. It's clearly one that exists here. B, I mean, it's a good question about what are they contributing to this effort. To the extent to which they obviously try to provide a narrative and a story about what Iran is doing in the region. I mean, in a sense, what the Warsaw Conference, I think, was about, to the extent that it focused on Iran, was having countries from the region identify specifically what the Iranians were doing, whether it was in Bahrain, or it's in the Eastern Province, or it's in Syria, or it's in Yemen, or it's in Lebanon. Very specific, I think, a bill of particulars about what the Iranians are doing. They didn't make that up. What the Quds force is doing is actually happening on the ground.
Are they helping to contain them?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I can see what the Israelis are doing to contain them in Syria. I'm not sure. Look, on the Saudis' part, they're the recipient because Houthi rockets are hitting Saudi Arabia. This is Iran's way of, in a very cheap way, from their standpoint, to bleed Saudi Arabia.
Does talking with the Iranians help to balance out some of the concerns about Saudi?
If Saudi Arabia talked
If
with
the
Iran?
U.S. were to talk to the Iranians?
It depends on what. I mean, what happened with JCPOA was the U.S. was talking to Iran behind the backs of its allies in the Gulf. And that thing was pulled as a surprise. And Iran's peripheral behavior, the nuclear file, was ignored. So this administration has a much stronger policy that recognizes the threat that Iran presents.
Although its approach to containing the, quote, malign activities of Iran is basically sanctions on the one hand and then encouraging regional parties on the other to assume the responsibility for countering it.
Which is why Saudi Arabia went to war in Yemen. People forget that. People have been saying...
Well, they went to war in Yemen during the Obama
Yes.
administration because they felt the Obama administration wouldn't impose any limits on
Well,
Iranians.
I would add another caveat to it. They felt, and like everybody, like Karen has been saying, that America was withdrawing from the region. Americans have been saying, in the public media, they've been saying that the Saudis want to fight Iran until the last American, and they've been saying the Saudis should carry their own water. So when an Iranian allied, affiliated, close to Iran organization took over Yemen, Saudi Arabia, instead of calling for G.I. Joe to come and help them, decided to go forward itself. And that is what caused them to go to war in Iran, because they are trying to carry their own water.
In Yemen,
Yemen.
Yeah.
And they're going up the learning curve, you see.
Karen, do you want to weigh in?
And I'm sorry, and just another thing about Yemen, when people talk about, well, you've had a difficult time in Yemen for the last 4 years. Yes, America's had a difficult time in Afghanistan for the last 18 years, you know. So these things are difficult wars, and the Saudi military is far less experienced than the American military.
I would just like to underscore, Aaron, on not getting completely consumed in the Middle East by only the U.S.-Saudi relationship, because Israel too has this very deep questions,
Right.
I think, about the reliability of the U.S. I mean, that's part of what makes the Saudis and the Israelis
Right.
talk to each
Right.
other now. And there are all kinds of things that could happen that could upset our interests. And the issue is, do we really believe we have interests anymore? You're saying we don't have a great interest on Saudi Arabia, but the president doesn't seem to think there's any particular interest in Syria, and Iraq, we make noises about they
They're like
ought
a
to be more
caretaker,
stable.
more of a
But
caretaker.
it's not a giant sucking sound yet, but it is a gentle, persistent breeze of us blowing out the other way.
Do you think that this kind of, I guess détente is too strong of a word, but this kind of warming of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia helps ameliorate some of the concerns about MBS in the region?
I think it now is, after Khashoggi, it has limits. I mean, I think the budding relationship between Israel and the Sunni Arabs, the two that they have formal treaties of peace with, and the Emiratis and the Saudis, are a response to a changing region. This is no longer your grandfather's or even your father's grandmother's mother's Middle East. I mean, the Saudis and Israelis are responding to what they perceive to be genuine changes and new threats. The rise of Iran and its capacity to project its power, transnational Sunni jihadi movement, and a certain amount of fatigue and exhaustion with the issue that had once deemed to be the key to American or stability in the region, the Israeli-Palestinian question. All of these things have fundamentally changed. I'm stunned by the fact that the state of Israel now has more diplomatic contacts, not only in the region, but in the world. Benjamin Netanyahu today got back from his 9th meeting with Vladimir Putin. 10th. The Israelis have some form of relationships with 160 countries in the world at a time when you have one of the most right-wing governments not interested in pursuing any meaningful peace process and continuing to expand Israeli settlement activity. And yet, it's extraordinary to me, in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe. So there's no doubt that there has been changes here. I just want to make one point about America's role. Look, we're faced with a real conundrum. We can't transform this region, and we can't extricate ourselves from it.
And we can't what?
Extricate. If there's no transformation and there's no extrication, then the only choice to define and defend American interests is what I call really smart transaction. And that means identifying what core American interests are. And I think we've had this discussion. I think there are 3. One is preventing another galactic attack on the homeland, or actions against our allies to the extent we can. A second is weaning ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbons, even though we have to realize that Dennis's point is compelling. And the Miller family has 2 SUVs. You want to explain why that is? I can't explain it. So there will be a time when the world might be free of hydrocarbons, but that time is in the distant future. And finally, we have no stake in allowing any single regional hegemon to emerge with a nuclear weapon. Now, I would argue in the first 2 categories, under both Obama and Trump, we're actually not doing badly. And had we not extricated ourselves from this flawed but still functional JCPOA, we might have at least maintained some distance between where we are now and where we are in the future.
I want to ask Dennis a question. There was this report the other day by the New York Times about these efforts to create nuclear power in Saudi Arabia at various sites. This group IP3, I believe you did some work on an advisory council of that. I don't need to get into that, but what do you think of the idea now, given what you know now, about the talk about providing Saudi Arabia with nuclear energy and possibly creating the potential, as a lot of people are, concerns about the spread of nuclear technology?
Look, I am to what drove IP3. I'm they asked me to advise them on their approach. The premise was that in the aftermath of JCPOA, you were going to have a reality where the Arab countries were going to say, okay, we get what they get. They get to enrich, therefore we get to enrich. Well, the worst outcome in the Middle East would be everybody enriches. So the whole idea was no indigenous enrichment. You get fuel from the outside, we provide fuel from the outside, we control that process. Therefore, this is a way to prevent proliferation. That still should be the posture. The last thing we want to see is every country in the region suddenly decides they're going to have their own nuclear power, but they're going to be able to enrich. So this, ironically, is an outgrowth. Aaron said JCPOA might have been functional, but it was flawed. Well, that was one of the flaws built into it. I want to go back to the interests that we have. I think what Aaron described is right. I would add one other one. And I would say it's probably a variation of what you're saying, Aaron. We have an interest in preventing vacuums from forming in the region. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the fact is, in power politics, the worst forces always tend to fill them. Now, the challenge for us is, how do we prevent vacuums in this region without sending thousands of Americans with boots on the ground, which itself is a huge mistake, and we've seen it. Well, it turns out if you have local partners who actually are willing to fight for themselves, have a kind of credibility because of that, if you support that, then maybe that's a way to manage it. Now, it turns out the Syrian Democratic Forces, Kurdish-led, Kurdish-dominated, but local Arab forces who were prepared to fight for their homes, was discovered late by the Obama administration. You could argue too little, too late, but it was actually a good model. You could go back to the Bush administration with the Awakening Councils in the last 2 years, the same thing. Identifying local partners that you can work with, and you provide the kind of support that doesn't require a major American presence, but helps them to be more effective than they would be on their own. Now, here again, this is something you can do with the Saudis as you look around the region, but it depends on something else. I was going to raise this earlier in response to one of your questions. What should we be doing? I would like to have a high-level strategic dialogue with Mohammed bin Salman on the order of every 3 to 4 months with a prepared agenda in advance, so that we also avoid surprises by him. Maybe if we'd had these kinds of discussions, maybe he wouldn't have done Qatar. Maybe he wouldn't have done Hariri. Maybe he would have approached Canada a little differently. Maybe he would have approached Germany a little differently.
Ollie, do you think he'd be amenable to that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, will he listen?
He listens to America. Look, Saudi Arabia has always listened to America. Now, the problem with America is America has ADD, and America is a world power. So it is focusing on so many different things at the same time, and the interests it has different interests that come up. But Saudi Arabia is very interested in this relationship with America and listens to America and takes it very seriously.
Yeah, just for the record, you put one 33-year-old in touch with another 33-year-old, and the messages that Saudi Arabia takes from America will be those messages.
No, but it's not that.
Dennis's point is right.
But
My model is you have
Pompeo's playing a
That's-
huge role.
But also, strategic dialogues are not about one man to one man.
No, that's right.
Yeah, the question
and you
is
create
whether or
agendas
not-
in advance.
Right, but that is going to depend on this administration surrendering certain prerogatives. Those strategic dialogues will be meaningless if, in effect, the diplomacy is not channeled through
Most of them are meaningless.
But it
now.
is. But it is. I mean, you are under.
We've gotten ourselves into a mess with the Saudis because we have personalized, quote unquote, our relationship with Saudi Arabia. We have invested in
one man.
several different individuals. And
Your institutions, like State Department, for example, and your Secretary of State, are extremely involved.
yeah, you've got a second Secretary of State in 2 years,
So,
and a third National Security Advisor.
But that is that's endemic to the American system.
Don't
you
argue
see.
me about process. This has been diplomatic and procedural malpractice on almost every issue. Yes, it would be great if, in fact, you could have a strategic dialogue that was actually approved by, run by, and institutionalized, where you actually had
Isn't there
input
one?
and it was structured. But that's not the way. It's not the way this is working. Just one additional point on the nuclear issue.
Yeah.
The Saudis have no right to say that as long as the Iranians enrich, we can enrich if they want U.S. nuclear technology.
I
They
agree.
want to buy from the South Koreans or the Chinese or the Russians, fine. But they need the
Well,
Atomic
but-
Energy,
but-
the
but
Atomic
Aaron,
Is
Energy
traveling
Act.
to China
Right,
and
the
India
Atomic
I don't
and
want-
Energy Act
Pakistan?
I
of
don't-
54,
what I'm
the
saying
123
is-
section.
Of course.
They need to sign a UAE gold standard.
I agree.
Gold standard 123 agreement.
Look,
Otherwise,
I-
we'd have to be crazy to surrender this to them.
We have an interest in ensuring that they don't go to others and have no restraints on them whatsoever. We have an interest that there isn't indigenous enrichment there.
I have one last question for Karen, and then I'm going to open it up. You see the Crown Prince, we talked about Russia, but also outreach to China and Pakistan. And do you think that there's more of an effort by him and his inner circle to look beyond the United States and kind of say, I need to diversify my own
Yeah, I think a lot of that, first of all, the Saudis began to reach out to China in maybe earlier, but certainly 2005, King Abdullah's first foreign trip was to China. So it's a long, slow process. I remember a Saudi minister telling me in 2007, I told Condoleezza Rice, if you Americans don't behave, we're all going to be speaking Chinese instead of English at this table. And now I see the Crown Prince is going to have Chinese taught in China. I mean, in Saudi Arabia. But I think that's also about investment, and it's about showing the Congress, while
They have
people are
options.
criticizing,
They have options.
that they have options.
Not to put too fine a point on it, the Saudis did buy missiles from the Saudis in the mid-1980s, from the Chinese in the
Silk
mid-1980s.
roads,
And
yeah.
and they completely were completely duplicitous about it in the way they dealt with us.
You're right.
Bandar.
You're right.
Okay, we're going to open it up. If you have a question, state your name, affiliation. Please limit it to a question so we can get a lot of questions in and not, a speech. Keep it to a question and keep it short so we can keep it moving along. We'll go here, then we'll go to Faraz, and then we'll go to this side of the room.
Thank you. It's a very, very interesting discussion. Kevin Murrain from SGH Macro Advisors in New York. Just a question, after the Khashoggi murder, this is for everyone on the panel, was there ever a sense that the senior princes in the Al Saud would have approached the king to seek the dismissal of the son as the crown prince or deputy crown prince, I can't figure what he was then, because they feared his erratic, impulsive behavior? And would they have done that and didn't do it because they didn't get a strong signal from the U.S. for
Ali.
that support?
I don't think they would have done that. I think the issue of his permanence has been totally sorted out. And there is no question that he retains the confidence of the king. So, and people know that. So it would have been a futile exercise for any of them to do, and I've not heard that anybody has done that.
But
We
Karen,
were
do you
told
see?
earlier that those kinds of things happen, but I heard nobody say that post-Khashoggi such a thing happened because his father is not.
But there is some concern, and there is some,
Oh, sure.
within the kind of royal family writ large, kind of there have been rumblings about.
No, so look, he has, in a way, his appointment as crown prince has disenfranchised 95% of the royal family. So is he the most popular man in the royal family? He's not, you see.
Is he more unpopular after this?
Well, no, I think they've tried to use it against him. Of course, I mean, every time you make a mistake, your critics are going to throw that at you. But he has secured the commanding heights of power and security in Saudi Arabia now, and I think his position is quite permanent.
Okay, for us.
Thank you for us, Maqsad Arabia Foundation. Elise, thank you for managing what is clearly a robust discussion. When I talk to people in the region, whether it's Lebanon, Syria, even Iraq, those who are inclined to the United States, who are friendly to the United States, they actually complain about too little Saudi Arabia, not too much Saudi Arabia. They feel that given the restructuring that's taking place at a domestic level, given the preoccupation with the near abroad, the war in Yemen, and the priority that that takes, that Saudi Arabia is no longer as engaged as it used to be, particularly in the Levant, again, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. So my question, and sort of we danced around this, but never really got into it. I think Dennis alluded to it with his talk about vacuum and nature abhorring vacuums. Is it in our interest to see more Saudi Arabia, a more engaged Saudi involvement in places that are in flux, but particularly where Iran is dominating? Or do we want less Saudi Arabia? And if it's not Saudi Arabia, I mean, this is the conundrum that I guess we're all grappling with here, is that as the US retrenches, who but Iran, Russia, and maybe Turkey, which is also moving closer to Russia and Iran, can fill that void?
You know, I think one of the interesting things about looking at the last 15 years has been the three Arab states that have traditionally dominated Arab politics for 70, 80 years, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, are all, my expression here, offline. They've all been through, varying degrees of dysfunction, decentralization, shackled with their own problems. I don't think that's a headline only. I think that's a trend line. As a consequence, that has opened up enormous opportunities for a couple Gulf states to insert themselves, Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. It's also produced a situation, I think, where the three most consequential actors in this entire region are the three non-Arabs. The three, Turkey, Israel, and Iran. They are all domestically stable. They all have tremendous economic potential. They all have militaries and intelligence organizations that are more than competent. One is a member of NATO. The other is America's closest regional ally. And a third is an outlier and a pariah. But they are functional. It's not good or bad that divides the Arab world these days. It's functional versus dysfunctional. And the Saudis, I think, have seen this vacuum, and whether willfully or not, inserted themselves.
Look, I would say in answer to your question, the Saudis do have a role to play, but I'd like it to be folded into some kind of strategic concept. And that's why we would bring it back to having a strategic dialogue with us, not just in a sense to be able to create maybe some of the checks that on decision making there, but also to channel it, but also for us to come up with what amounts to a kind of broader division of labor, not just between us and the Saudis, but how do all of those who are American partners in the region, how do they work with us? What do we do with them? What might we ask of them? What are they going to ask of us? Certainly with the Saudis withdrawing from Lebanon, I don't think that's a positive thing.
And that's kind of the opposite of what you're saying, which is you think it should just be episodic and transactional. Is that?
Well, I mean, look, in order to do what Dennis is saying, and I think it's a terrific idea, you'd actually need to have, and I come back to whether or not this entire discussion is more along the lines of a thought experiment. You need an administration that was interested, willfully interested in so many things with respect to this region. So I think Dennis' idea is right. It's just for a galaxy far, far away. It's not for what's happening back here on planet Earth.
Look,
I think your analysis
of
of what's happened with the power relationships is absolutely right. And the result of that, though, is that Iran continues to win.
Right.
Their influence is spreading, and we don't seem either to take that seriously or have any effective way to confront it if we take it seriously, partly for the reasons I think you're enunciating.
I want to add just one point to what Karen is saying. You know, if you want Qasem Soleimani to succeed, you allow him to operate and show all of his gains in the region. You don't impose limits on him. You don't impose costs. You think that this debate between Rouhani and Soleimani is taking place without regard to Soleimani's being able to say, look where we have dominant influence now. Okay, yeah, the Americans are imposing sanctions, but you know what? The Americans are leaving. We're here, and look where we're gaining.
Amy.
Thank you. Amy Hawthorne from the Project on Middle East Democracy. Thanks for a very lively conversation. Almost exactly 40 years ago, a dictatorial monarch very close to the United States who imposed change on his society and claimed to be modernizing from above was swept from power in an Islamic revolution that had a very heavy anti-American backlash component to it. And the US invested very heavily and mostly very uncritically in this leader, telling itself, or telling ourselves at the time for all those decades, that the Shah of Iran was essential to transform his country, keep it stable, and to an essential part of our fight against what was deemed the US major threat at the time, security threat, the Soviet Union. As we know, that relationship ended in spectacular failure. So keeping in mind, of course, the important differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also keeping in mind, as Aaron said, that the region today is very different than it was 40 years ago, sometimes history has a very strange way of rhyming. So my question for the panel is, how does the United States avoid making this disastrous mistake again with a similar, allegedly modernizing dictatorial monarch? Thank you.
Aaron.
I mean, you're right. I mean, it's fascinating parallel, although Iran is a very serious country with enormous potential, human potential, economic potential, military potential, nuclear potential. That's not Saudi Arabia. But I think the notion of a modernizing monarchy is one that existed actually from the beginnings of the relationship. I remember what my predecessor, State Department, in the 40s said about Abdulaziz, that this was a man who was practical, pragmatic, willing to deal with the Americans as a balancer to the British. So I think, look, I just think my modern Gulliver reference was not done unintentionally. I really think we need to be very clear about how we view this region, and I think we don't view it correctly. I would not get drawn into the Saudi-Iranian war. In my judgment, we ought to confront Iran when it suits our interests, and we ought to cooperate with the Iranians when it serves those interests. That ought to be the prime directive, to borrow a Star Trek trope, to guide our policy. And yet we have enabled and created the reality, and Dennis is right. I mean, malign activities, influence in 5 Arab capitals, the potential to further Iranian interests, all of it is true. Serial human rights abuser, I mean, it's all true. Nonetheless, we have to be extremely careful that we don't turn Iran into the greatest threat to the fulcrum of Western civilization since Nazi Germany. And as you know, those tropes and parallels have been made by one of our closest allies. Because if in fact Iran is Nazi Germany, then we have a moral strategic obligation to do everything we can to defeat it. And the reality is, Dennis is right, this administration is unbelievably risk averse when it comes to any kinetic interaction between the US and Iran anywhere. And today our president is meeting with Kim Jong-un. He would turn on a dime if he had an opportunity to sit with Rouhani. So I agree. We have to be extremely careful that we don't.
If I can just add an analogy.
Where's the mic?
Before the Shah fell, the cognoscenti in the West, the intellectual class, were highly critical of him, his savak, his lack of human rights, corruption in Iran. And when he fell, and I was a student at university here at that time, there was a lot of support among the American intellectual class for that. And what happened? You got a worse dictator. Human rights went 100 times worse. You got 500,000 people killed, if not 1 million people killed in Iranians. You had 3 million Iranians thrown out, and you've had destabilization from Iran for the last 40 years. So it's an analogy of having an imperfect ally or partner and working with that partner to gradually encourage improvement, or taking this idealistic absolutist approach and then paying a very heavy price.
So you're just saying, Congress, watch out what you wish for?
I'm just saying that appreciate what you have and work with it And yes, encourage, absolutely, use your strategic dialogue, use your influence to encourage Saudi Arabia in the right direction, but appreciate that if something happened to the system, what will come after that will have cataclysmic effects on the region and on your interests.
I would just add, Amy, that I think we have to have our eyes open. Where we see the Crown Prince crossing lines, we could call him on it.
Like, you can't just say, oh, that's just MBS.
No,
But
you
the
shouldn't.
sad thing is that Jamal Khashoggi was not a threat. I mean, I just don't see how you
that
could
was-
construe that he
Look,
was.
history, people underestimate stupidity sometimes, right?
And
And,
I just-
I think it was a combination of incompetence and stupidity, and inexperience in the system.
And hubris. I mean, I'm just going to
Arrogance,
say one
exactly.
thing.
But the
to this-
significant point is
Right.
it's the lack of understanding, it seems to me, about what the real threats are.
Right.
You know,
I mean,
if
I
one
think a
thought
lot of
Jamal
people
was
in this
one.
town were guilty of kind of embracing what the Crown Prince represented and not listening to what people with Jamal when he first started were saying, which was, I think he's got a lot of potential. I think he's got a lot of wonderful things that he wants to do, but keep this in mind. And so they threw the baby out with the bathwater, and he became this like big, I think his activism grew along the way. But the same people that were embracing the Crown Prince now have totally abandoned him in the wake of Jamal. But maybe if they had listened in the beginning, we wouldn't be here.
Oda Aberdeen. There is one core American interest that was not mentioned in
Okay.
this discussion. Every day, 4 million Americans go to work because of our trade with the GCC. That has an impact on domestic politics. Imagine if 4 million Americans lose their job, what would be the consequences?
Are you saying that if the U.S. abandoned its relationship with Saudi, 4
Not saying- I'm
million
talking
people
about
would
the-
be out of work?
No, yeah, I'm talking about the GCC. 4 million Americans go to work every day
Okay.
because of our exports, cars,
Okay, true.
technology,
Yep.
medicine, consultants, you name it. And that should be taken into account. I just have one other comment. Today, there are 19 inter-Arab conflicts in the whole region. I don't know if we have the expertise to manage it or to keep it under control.
Okay. On the 19 conflicts, Karen, is the Crown Prince managing them?
No, but I mean, the Arab world has had perpetual conflicts perpetually. So we can't manage them, and I don't think the Crown Prince can manage them. To me, again, the issue is priorities, and I think the U.S. ought to keep its priority on trying to assure stability in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia.
To the economic point.
I mean, sure, but I mean, usually when we think about the Middle East, we think about vital American interests. Now, I mean, obviously, yes, and the president would obviously make the same argument, but I don't think any of that is in danger or in jeopardy, Oda.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you. Andrew Steinfeld, former FSO. This is fun because it's like a SMEC meeting.
For those of you who don't understand the reference.
Exactly.
We won't
Most
go-
people
we
will
won't go
understand
into
it. Anyway, this is mainly for you, Ali, but also for others. I guess I'm having trouble sometimes getting my arms around putting authoritarianism and reform in the same sentence. Revolution from above as a concept. It seems to me that you admit now that MBS has the commanding heights of power. There's no reason that that will change. In a period of decades or perhaps 50 years, I think history has shown that most leaders, whether it's a Ben Ali or a Mubarak or any one of a host of African potentates, they get less reformist over time, not more reformist over time. Power goes to the head and they don't want to give it up. So I'm just seeing, if we imagine a leader in power in any country for 40 or 50 years, to me that is a bit of a frightening thought. I mean,
You had
there's a
it in
reason.
Jordan.
There's a reason after we had Roosevelt for 16 years, we passed an
You had it
amendment.
in Jordan, right? King Hussein was a leader for 40 years. And he was a highly popular leader in this country. So was Gaddafi. Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I don't think you have that. Look,
You're not comparing MBS to Gaddafi?
no, no, certainly not.
And certainly not comparing MBS to King Hussein.
Yeah,
hope
no. He's bolder than King Hussein. King Hussein was not very bold, but he didn't have the
He's
resources that he had.
reckless and impulsive.
But at the end of the day, reform can only come from above. Give me an example in our region. And by the way, if you look at Saudi Arabia with its autocracy for the last 100 years, it's been the most successful Arab country. If you were going to land from Mars by parachute 100 years ago, would you have landed in even Iran or Iraq, its peers, or Algeria or Libya, any one of the large oil-rich states? Or look at Venezuela. It has managed its oil wealth, and its people have gotten a net benefit after you subtract waste and after you subtract corruption in excess of any other of its peers.
That's
even
not the
though,
question, though.
no, but it's talking about the success in a way of authoritarianism.
It's
So,
more than just economics.
well, yes and no. Tell that.
Participation in your society.
Well, tell
All
that to the
things we learn
Venezuelans.
as enlightened
Yeah.
Westerners.
Well, it's a
We're
question.
talking about MBS. Let's
Yeah,
not
no,
compare
it's
it
a
to
question.
Venezuela.
It's not of the ideal menu available. It's you look at your peers and you say, what have your peers been able to achieve? And then you compare. So compared to Norway, of course not. Compared to Sweden, of course not. But you know what? Compared to Iran, you can talk about Iran all you like, but if you're an Iranian, your GDP has gone down by 70% in the last 3-4 years, while in the last 40 years, while Saudi's GDP has tripled.
I think we should be,
So you're
we
saying
should
that the ends do justify
understand.
the means?
Well, this is the best you have. And I'm saying that it has been the most successful model in the region. And so we have to deal with reality, not idealism. And Americans have played this game of trying to promote idealism, and people have paid a heavy
Although
price.
there's an irony here, I have to say, Ali, that when you say that Saudi Arabia has been the most successful model, the whole attraction of MBS is that he's transforming Saudi
Yes.
Arabia. All right, well, if it's such a successful model, why does it need to be transformed so
because
fundamentally?
it is still, even if he didn't transform it, it's more successful for its people than Iran, than Iraq, than Algeria, than
But that is
Venezuela.
running out. That's a result of
Exactly. Well, look,
excess oil revenue.
That's why
No,
he's
and-
trying
No, but
It is
Karen, sorry,
important.
excuse me.
Can I just
It's
make
not a
one-
result of excess oil revenue. It's a result of managing oil revenue. In other words, the Venezuelans got oil 30 years before Saudi Arabia, and they have more oil than Saudi Arabia. So my point is, compared to its peers, it has managed its oil for its people
And that
better
phase,
than anybody.
that phase has run out. That's
No,
why
that phase
Which is
hasn't
why
run
he's
out.
doing,
It
which is
is-
why he's doing what he's
The
doing.
trend lines
Right.
look worrying.
trend lines are
And he
worse.
needs to work
But
on
he
it.
No, that's why
he
he's transforming the
says-
country
Yes,
now.
exactly.
He says that phase has run out. I
Right.
mean, my house
No.
of fire thing,
Yes.
most Saudis don't think the house is on fire, but he
No,
actually.
I think he's right, but the trend,
does.
he's looking at the trend lines. You
But
see.
the important thing, I think, is he does not in any way say, I am a Democrat.
No.
He's not duping us.
No,
His
right.
definition of reform is,
Right.
I want an economy that works. To have an economy that works, I have to be able to attract smart outside, I have to get smart Saudis to work. So I have to let women work. That means I have to let them drive. I have to let people have some entertainment in their life. And certainly if I want to attract the best and brightest from abroad, not just the, street sweepers and menial labor, I have to have a society in which they want to live. So I have to give them entertainment. He does not in any way that I've ever heard
No,
or
he doesn't.
read
He doesn't claim
say,
it. That's right.
and what we really need is more democratic
Well,
dialogue.
here's the question, okay? Ali, if he has absolute power, as you say, then he has absolute power to be a Democrat or, someone who is going to have a more inclusive society. I mean, if he's not worried about, losing any constituency and he has a solid grip on power, then why the need for this type of authoritarian behavior?
The participatory model has not worked in any similar country in the region. So ideally, Would he be able to do everything like this and have full freedoms and democracy? Of course, right? Would he be like the Queen of Sweden? That would be ideal, right? But the question is, you look at your peers, and no participatory political model has worked. And I believe, for example, that if he had thrown the women's driving thing to a vote, it would have been shut down. You know, there was the Shura Council, which is really members of the elite who are brought in, highly educated members of the elite who are brought into a consultative council. Just 2 years ago, they discussed the issue of appointing a woman ambassador, and they said it would be outrageous. So he is ahead of his people, you see. Now, the ideal model would be for that to take place with freedom and participation, etc. But there hasn't been a model that works.
They don't think it's necessary. I mean, I interviewed Salman in 2010 when he was governor, and Mohammed bin Salman was there, and he watched his father throughout. And when his father explained to me, we can't have democracy here because we have too many tribes and every tribe would be a party and then we would have chaos. So we have consultation, and when the people can't agree, we decide. And MBS said, yes, in response to that, yes, my maternal grandfather killed your uncle. In other words, killed his paternal grandfather's uncle. You know, so it.
No, but Karen, I don't think anybody denies. I think, and even intelligent members of the royal family.
They do see authority as necessary.
Even intelligent members of the royal family. In the future, if you can have more of a participatory system, and where the monarchy is more constrained, that will be a more sustainable model. They understand that. In this moment,
but he doesn't believe this is the time for it.
No, this is not the time for it. He would not be able to do anything.
Okay,
in that thing.
let's move on. Okay, we have about 7 or 8 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a lightning round of questions. If you have a question, please answer it. Raise your hand. Okay, first we're going to go to Adam. And then after that, we're going to answer that question, Ambassador Early.
Ishan Farouz from the Washington Post.
And then we're going to go to...
Demanding airtime.
I don't see him. Where? Okay.
Stand up, Washington Post. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you back there. Okay, and then we're going to go to Hisham, and then we'll... going to take a lightning round from this side, okay? And I see you.
So my name is Adam Early, and I'm on the board of the Arabia Foundation, and my question is for Dennis and Karen. Dennis, you've made I think, a compelling case about the importance of the National Reform Program and Vision 2030 and all that sort of stuff, and said it's in the U.S. interest for this to succeed for the reasons you stated. Question for the both of you who have been to Saudi Arabia recently and seen the transformation, but related to what Amy asked, what are the threats to the success of the National Reform Program over the next 10, 20 years? What's going to keep it? I guess 2 questions. How are you going to judge its success? And what are the disruptors or the things that can threaten its success, which we should be keeping our eye out for and working to obviate?
Okay, and let's also, I'm so sorry, I didn't see it back there.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Ali, for calling me out. Ishan Thuru, the Washington Post. Thank you all for this incredibly engaging panel. To go back to MBS's trip to China, while he was there, he seemed to go out of his way to defend Beijing's alleged detention of over 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in camps in the far western region. We know in private that he's a person who's much more interested in talking about the Israeli tech sector than he is about the plight of Palestinians. Could you talk a bit about where he stands vis-a-vis the rest of the Muslim world and what that sort of says about the kind of ideological figure that he is?
Is that question to me?
That could be to you or to anybody else.
Okay, Dennis and Karen, why don't you take the first one and then we'll go to China.
I would like to just say one thing. He has laid out all these targets. There are 13 vision realization programs and 1,300 initiatives, and everybody's got KPIs, and there's a whole institution that tracks it quarterly, et cetera. I think the big vulnerability is going to be economic reform. You know, where you've had nothing on the cultural front, it's easy to give, and it's easy to build hotels and easy to get the religious to change their mind that
Well, it's not easy to get the religious to change their mind.
well, that Madan Salah and things like that are not
That was a
blasphemy.
huge challenge that 50 years of Saudi leaders did not have the courage
Yes,
to take on.
and I don't mean, but relative to changing the economy, even controlling the
People might have said that
religious,
would have been more difficult. I mean, I thought it would be more difficult. I would have never.
the economy is the biggest obstacle in my view is that too many Saudis take the view of show me, what are you going to do for me? And they aren't yet convinced that cuts in subsidies and increases, the new tax, et cetera, are going to make things better because the economy has stalled. So I think his biggest challenge is finding enough educated, motivated people to get on the bandwagon and help pull it when so many people are either against it, like the religious conservatives, or for people who are neither for nor against it, they just want to know what's in it for me, and I'm used to getting what I want without doing much.
Okay, we
I
have
would say-
we have about 5 minutes, so we're gonna, yeah.
All right, I want to answer the question too. I want to build on what Karen was saying. He has all sorts of different targets, and the more you start pushing off those targets, the more questions are going to be raised about the efficacy of the whole plan. So there are particular targets as it relates to reducing the budget deficit. Those have been pushed off now. There are specific targets about what percent of the economy should now be shaped by the private sector, not just how much it contributes to the GDP, but how much of the economy is now, what percentage of it is, in fact, in the private sector. It gets to this whole question of changing the political culture enough so the approach to work changes as well. How do you manage this at a time when, in fact, your own reserves are going down? And yet, if you want to preserve, in fact, support for the changes, life somehow can't become harder. I mean, part of the reason for the focus on entertainment is not simply because you want to make it more attractive on the outside. You want to create a sense here that he's changing things so much, okay, we'll cut him more slack to give him more time. Because most of the social changes, not with everybody, but most social changes are popular. So I think you have to watch some of these economic indices and how well he's doing. That'll give you an indication of whether or not, he's facing a different set of pressures as a result.
Okay, Ali, just quickly on the Hisham's question on the
Chinese?
Yeah.
No, look, I mean, maybe he should not have come out and said it so bluntly, but ultimately, Saudi Arabia cannot move China. China is the largest market for Saudi oil. And in this environment, frankly, a relationship with China is critical. So the interests of the nation state supersede the sort of pan-Islamic interests of the country that hosts the holy places. That's only natural, and that's realpolitik, and that's what happened.
Okay, we have just a couple of questions left. We're going to go to this gentleman right there, then we're going to go to that woman. I think I pointed her out back there, and then we're going to go to this gentleman there, and we're going to wrap it up.
Hi, thank you. I'm Alex from Deck Projects. So Karen and Dennis, you alluded to the social compact essentially being restructured. The quid pro quo of welfare state for no representation doesn't exist anymore. And that leads it very precariously on the economic reforms. The social liberalization has given some respite, but the economic reform hasn't really worked as well. I mean, austerity is Vision 2030 in the eyes of the average Saudi. So what can the Crown Prince do to mitigate the risk of having his 50-year reign depend on economic success, perhaps in political reform or anything else? Because I worked in the private sector in Saudi Arabia, and we're completely crowded out. I mean, we're not given a chance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Jasmine El Gamal at the Atlantic Council. I recently moved to the region after living here for 11 years. And I have to say that from the region, I have never seen US policy so out of touch with and so unconcerned for the actual people who live in the region. It's pretty amazing to see. So my question is, if we're going to double down on our relationships with individuals in all of these different countries, including the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, That's fine. That's our choice. We're going to make it. But what does that look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I want to push the panel to articulate what kind of leverage we have and how we're going to use it with those leaders that we have those relationships with, to be a little bit more in touch with their people and to give them more of a chance to have a life of dignity that they deserve.
Thanks,
you.
Jasmine. And then also just pass the mic to this gentleman in the orange shirt. Super quick, super quick.
Hi, Bo Wilcox from Middle East Institute, program intern. I wanted the panel to elaborate more on the discussions of nuclear energy within Saudi Arabia. Who are the actors involved? What stage is the dialogue at? And go from there.
Okay, thank you. And then we're just going to wrap it up right here.
Yeah, Ali's comments just a moment ago that the region is not ready for democratization. The same argument was made about Latin America until it democratized, and about the Asia until it democratized. I strongly disagree that MBS is ahead of his people. I think the majority of people in Saudi Arabia, especially people under 40, which is the majority, do want change. I think that the description of men and women sitting together, if they were allowed to and didn't want to, they wouldn't be doing so. And I don't know anyone across the region who sees Saudi Arabia, the citizens who see Saudi Arabia as a model. My question is, what should the price be? I think there was consensus other than Ali among the speakers that MBS should pay a price for the Jamal Khashoggi murder. What should it be?
Okay, and then one more. It better be quick. I'm serious.
Thank you for a great
I will
panel.
cut you off.
Yes, this is Rami from the Arab Gulf State Institute. I write about culture. I'm a PhD student. First of all, a lot of politicians talk about the American values.
What's the question?
Nobody, we all share the same values of killing an innocent man. So I don't like to hear that as a Saudi person from the people. And so my question is, what do you think, or how do you do you understand the complexity of the microcultural needs and priorities of the people when you make decisions? Or do we just make decisions based on, why don't we talk about the people that are responsible for this incident instead of talking about just the people of Saudi Arabia?
Thank you. Okay, so I think what we'll do is, we have a lot to unpack there, but we'll put it in the realm of some closing thoughts. We have 2 questions on why isn't there not enough attention paid to the people of Saudi Arabia, about the leverage that we have on the Saudis moving forward, and then the space for the economic reform.
I'm not sure I even understand what that means. We're much more comfortable, as you know, in dealing with individuals who hold power, individuals with whom, and institutions with which we can strike transactional bargains to further American interests. And that has primarily meant dealing, as I mentioned before, with a bunch of acquiescent authoritarians, most of whom are now long since departed. We don't do well on the issue of civil society. We'd like to. We have a lot of very smart, creative people. But in view of what's occurred over the last several years in the Arab world, so-called Arab Spring, we're actually resented in large part for preaching and for promoting quote unquote American values as if we're condescending to the people of the region. I can't imagine a situation in which an American president will continue to do anything else other than, Obama tried, primarily through his words and perhaps through some deeds, to create another frame. Right side of history, popular sovereignty. The United States was going to make human rights a more central part of its agenda. This administration has emptied the frame of American foreign policy of any moral or ethical sensibilities whatsoever. It intervened selectively in Turkey, freeing Pastor Brunson, in Venezuela, in large part, I suspect, because Maduro is probably one of the few authoritarians that hasn't criticized Donald Trump, and it is the Western Hemisphere, and he personally has an interest in this. Marco Rubio introduced him
we're not going on
too.
Venezuela.
Right. So I understand your question, and I sympathize and empathize with it, but watching the way government actually behaves, I have very little hope and expectation that we're going to change the way that we've operated for decades.
I will just make one point. I think your point about how the 30 and under people are in pace with the prince is actually true. A lot of those people, I think it is part of what gives him the confidence to make some of the decisions he makes. He is one of them, at least in age, and understands that, as people say, they were doing most of this stuff at home, but now they can do it in public. They can dance and they can watch Mariah Carey. They were watching all this stuff. It's not like this is shocking new culture to them. It's just that it's public now. And I think that's important. I mean, I think you have to feel for the poor guy in that he has, he does have a big ambitious plan, and he does I believe he sincerely thinks he's doing the right thing, moving fast. But Saudi people are not into fast movement, and he's got a handful of problems. So I, for one, am not holding my hand up to be the Crown Prince's advisor.
And Dennis, when you speak, like, could you also the questions about how U.S. policy is more just not taking into consideration like what the people want or need?
If you were to look at polling of attitudes in the Arab world, Arab countries towards the United States over the last, since the Clinton administration, I would say that you would find consistently that the United States would poll terribly with very different kinds of administrations. The idea, and there's a lot of different explanations for that. Would it be good if there was a way for us to create a kind of more obvious connection to the peoples of the region? Of course. Aaron was talking about Obama. I happen to remember the first 2 years of Obama, when Obama gives a speech in Cairo and actually was trying to say how different he was from Bush because we weren't about the democracy agenda. We weren't lecturing. So we haven't found, and you said this actually earlier, we haven't found a particularly good formula for connecting with peoples in the Middle East for a long time. Probably the right thing to do is for us, and for this administration, values are not an important part of how they define foreign policy. I do think more traditional American values ultimately should be one of the guideposts of our policy, not because you can be fully consistent, not because you won't have to make accommodation to short-term interests, you will, but because one of the reasons we've also, regardless of what the polls showed about us, even when there was a highly negative view of the United States, asked people where they wanted to come. They wanted to come here because we stood for something. We should still try to stand for something, even as we measure and make what are short-term judgments that every administration has to make.
Ali, as you close, I want to give a kind of word to what our Saudi friend in the back was saying about the people involved, and that the Saudis do not, the Saudis are just like the U.S. in the sense that, it's not that we may not have all the same values, but they don't agree with the killing of an innocent man, particularly one of their citizens. So, how is the Saudi leadership going to fix specifically the Jamal program? The U.S. has been pushing to get in a better place on the Jamal issue. Are they going to take action in a credible fashion and make the climate better? I mean, specific people being, I'm not talking about, structural changes. I'm talking about specific people being brought to trial, prosecuted, and convicted and punished.
Look, Saudi Arabia has said ad nauseum, from the Crown Prince and the King down, that this was a horrible mistake. It was a horrible thing. Some people get annoyed if you use the word mistake, okay? And that it is something that the kingdom has never done and does not plan to indulge in. Now, when governments, failure is an orphan and success has many fathers. So even within the Saudi system, people started running for cover. Now, there is a legal process being put together. Is it going to be as a New York type legal process with CNN and everybody looking at it? No. But it's going to be a legal process under the constraints of Sharia law, which will produce a document that will show that you have gone through a certain amount of due process. But at the end of the day, the Jamal tragedy was the death of one individual. And the stability of Saudi Arabia is the lives of 30 million people, and the Middle East around it, tens of millions more. So a horrible crime has to be put in context. And you cannot...
I don't think there's, I'm sorry.
You cannot drag the whole country on one issue.
The question is given the fact that this was an international incident, and you say that the Saudis have suffered, is there going to be a trial which meets international standards, including the rights of accused?
I don't know. I mean, I am not a government official. You should ask a government official that.
But you would like to see that, right?
Certainly, I would like to see some accountability and punishment. I think they are. They say they are. We will have to see.
I mean, we are running out of time, but I really want to just one more moment nail down on what you said about this is the death of one individual, and we have to balance it against the rights of 30 million Saudi citizens. It's not about the death of one individual.
20 million Saudi citizens, 30 million people.
It's not about the death of one individual. It's about people in this country acting outside of the norms of of international law, Saudi behavior. And I would think that this is a concern for all of those 20 million Saudis.
Well, of course, they were all horrified. And it was something that horrified everybody. But, has America behaved outside the confines of the law? It has. Have other countries done it? They have. So again, you have to put it in context.
What's the context?
The context is that the price has been paid, and certain people will pay a price. Will it satisfy everybody in Washington? I don't know. We will see. That's a question you have to ask the government. But at the end of the day, one has to move forward. And one will move forward, you see, because ultimately the interests of a country and the interests of a region are more important.
We will not move forward if in fact nothing is learned either by the government of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince or this administration or the next. The killing of Jamal was the culmination of a series of irresponsible, reckless, and impulsive actions driven by a degree of permissiveness, unprecedented, frankly, in the history of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And if the continuation of these signals of empowering, without constraint, without red line, continue, then nothing will be learned.
Sure, but they won't continue, is my expectation.
My expectations that people will be tried, presumably a number will be executed, as if to create closure on this, will not in fact be the case. It'll be fascinating to see if and when the next time the Crown Prince or King comes to the United States, what the circumstances will be, what the reception will be, because it's going to speak volumes about the nature of this relationship.
I think
and time will tell.
I think exactly. I think everyone on this panel, I don't think there's anyone, even Aaron, on this panel, who would say that everyone can't move forward, but I think everyone would also acknowledge that it can't be business as usual. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to my panelists.